Protect the people! Protect and so! Protect the people! Protect and so!
Okay, can you say who you are and where you're from?
Okay, I'm Walden Bello, and I am the executive director, a former executive director focusing on the Global South, currently senior analyst, and I'm a professor of sociology at the University of the Philippines. And I'm also the president of the Freedom from Debt Coalition of the Philippines.
Thank you. And can you say a bit about your perspective on the linkage between climate change and broader corporate globalisation issues?
Well, I definitely think that the neoliberal trading system, with its hostility to any sort of controls to trade, and is very much part and parcel of the problem. However, I think we need to understand why there is free trade, because this is very much part of a system of production that continues to value growth, and very high growth, because profitability is dependent on the continued high growth of consumption and the universalization of this consumption standards and values. So I think if we have a perspective that climate change is not linked to the trading system and the system of production, I think that this is a perspective that is relatively uninformed and therefore dangerous. And this is precisely the kind of perspective that many of the leaders of business and governments would like us to believe, that somehow you can decouple climate change from the system of trade and production, and that you can decouple growth from the horribly wasteful consumption of energy, and the very high degree of carbonization that's connected with that consumption.
So you very much see Western style models of consumption and growth as being essentially part of this broader problem?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think that here we need to be really quite frank. And let me just say that, when you ask George Soros, what is the cause of, the recurrent financial crisis, he says it's the dynamics of global capitalism. And when you ask him to what, is the source of the great trading inequalities, he writes and says it's global capitalism. But when we say that, we mention the C word, I think you have people basically saying, oh wow, you can't say that. So it's very strange, kind of reaction, that when a big financier says it's capitalism, it's legitimate, but when we say it, it's not. The point that I'm making is that we really need to look at the dynamics of global capitalism, because capitalism is a system of transforming living nature into dead commodities, and then having the dance of those commodities rule our lives into higher and higher degrees of consumption. So I would say, therefore, that the ultimate solution to this issue of climate change, as well as to the broader environmental crisis, is a transformation of our consumption as well as our production to more democratic kinds of control over production.
So for as campaigners on these wide range of issues, what do you think we should be focusing our energies on? How do you think we should try and do this?
I think there's the short term, and there's the medium term, and there's the long term. I think in the short term there's no way that we can avoid the fact that deep mandatory reductions are essential, and this mandatory reductions in greenhouse gas emissions have to be much deeper than that's being proposed by the G8, which is translates into 85% cuts by 2050 from 1990 levels. So it's got to be deeper than that at this point. The second thing is, I think that a number of countries in the South, including China, should be part of a mandatory regime. And I think at this point that the second biggest, if not the biggest, greenhouse gas emitter would be exempted from a mandatory regime, I think is not a go. And that's from the point of view of people in the South, but for most developing countries, I don't think that they should be part of such a mandatory regime because their contribution to climate change is very minimal, if not non-existent, especially in the case of very poor island societies. So this is really what we're talking about in the short term. But in the medium term, I think we need to talk about the fact that it's not just a case of energy efficiency. It's not just a case of it's not a case of techno fixes. I mean, it's horrible that the IEA announced today that between 2013,
that's International Energy Agency.
Yes, the internet. What it sees as the solution to the climate crisis is between 2013 and 2030 the introduction of 22 nuclear powers a year, and annually 2 dams of the scale of the Three Gorges. That's the word that they use. So I mean, there's this fixation on techno fixes, and I think that this is not the way to go. Besides, many of those technologies are still 40 years away. When we talk about some of these things that they're putting forward, like effective carbon sequestration. So I think this is a way of avoiding the fact that growth is the problem, and growth is the problem because of the constant encouragement of consumption that is at the base of profitability. And so I think that in the medium term, we really need to move away from this model of consumption orientation that is really at the center of the problem.
We need to look at very different ideas of progress
Yes.
and
Right. Yes.
kind of advancement,
Sure.
or whatever you want to call it.
Sure, I think in the medium term we have to tackle the consumption issue. In the long term, you cannot divorce consumption from production, which means that we have to think about democratic controls of production, and whether you call that socialism or popular capitalism or popular control or democratic empowerment in the economy, I don't care. The important thing is, in the end, the environmental crisis can only be addressed by democratic control over the economy. So I think we're talking about basically long, short, and medium term kind of solutions to this.
But either way, it's a fundamental change.
Either way, it's fundamental change that I think is really quite essential at this point. And I think that the solutions being proposed, which is by some of these renegade governments right now, like the United States and Japan and Canada, and this so-called Asia-Pacific partnership that they've formed, voluntary cuts and emissions trading schemes. I mean, I think this is not really going to hack it at this point. So, so I think that's the challenge is very big. If we can get mandatory cuts, that's just a first step. And I think a more important step really will be the transformation of the models of economic organization and consumption that we have at the moment.
Thanks very much for your time, Walden.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen.